It's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, who's Dr. David Williams. Dr. David Williams is the Florence and Laura Norman Professor of Public Health and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. His prior academic appointments were at Yale for 6 years and here at the University of Michigan for 14 years. He holds an MPH from Loma Linda University and a PhD from sociology from the University of Michigan. He is an internationally recognized authority on social influences on health, and he's been invited to give keynote scientific addresses in Europe, Africa, Australia, the Middle East, South America, and across the US. The author of more than 500 scientific papers, his research has enhanced our understanding of the ways in which race, socioeconomic status, stress, racism, health behavior, and religion can affect health. The everyday discrimination scale that he developed is the most widely used measure of discrimination in health studies. Dr. Williams is also an elected member of the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Medicine, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK. He's been ranked as the most cited Black scholar in the social sciences worldwide and as one of the world's most influential scientific minds. Dr. Williams has been involved in the development of health policy at the national level as well, and he currently serves on the board of trustees of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and on the Kellogg Foundation Solidarity Council on Racial Equity. He has been featured by some of the nation's top print and television news organizations, and his TED Talk has been viewed over 2 million times. It's also my distinct personal pleasure to welcome Dr. Williams, as he's a scholar that I've admired for many years. So thank you, Dr. Williams.
Thanks so much for the kind words of introduction, and it's truly a privilege to be here with you at the University of Michigan. My slides up, look a little clearer on my screen. If you look a little carefully, you would see this is a slide background I use in all of my presentations, and you can clearly see it is maize and blue. And that is not by accident. I don't usually point it out to audiences, but there's a reason for it. Okay. I am very thankful to this place. This place has made me who I am today as a scholar, and it's truly an honor and privilege to be invited back for this special celebration. So I was given the topic of talking about understanding the change in social context and how to measure it. And I thought that I would do that through an area in which I do work, the area of race, which illustrates many opportunities and challenges in terms of measuring. We measure, in general, what we think matters, and what is measured and presented matters. So I want us to think more deeply about what we measure and present, because it can matter profoundly. My first point I want to make is there are large racial ethnic differences in health in the US and around the world. This is one example, national data for the United States, infant mortality for 2018, and you could see blacks, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, American Indians, Alaska Natives, have markedly elevated rates of infant mortality compared to the white population. Hispanics are slightly higher. A point was made about the heterogeneity of Latino populations. Even if we just broke out Latinos by immigrant status, we would see striking differences between the US-born and the foreign-born. I have slides of data from multiple other countries. I'll just show you one in the interest of time. And here's infant mortality by ethnicity in England and Wales. And you can see Pakistani, blacks from Africa, Bangladeshi, blacks from the Caribbean, and Indians all have markedly elevated rates of infant mortality. That is true for most health outcomes in the UK. You see a similar pattern, and that pattern exists. I have data for most countries in Latin America, for Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. You see the same pattern everywhere. And I think it's critical to situate current racial data in the larger historical context. So one way of making sense of the data is putting it into historical context. And racial inequities in health have existed for, in fact, a long time. So here's life expectancy at birth, a very widely used indicator of overall health in countries, from 1950 to 2010. And you can see that whites, on average, lived 8 years longer than blacks in 1950. Now, there's good news in the data. Life expectancy over time, every decade, is getting higher for African Americans, getting higher for whites, and so that in 2010, there's a 4-year gap. At the same time, Look at the life expectancy at whites in 1950, 69.1 years, and let's ask how long did it take for African Americans to catch up to the health that whites had in 1950. It was not until 1990, 40 years later, that blacks had the health that whites experienced in 1950. And then we need to attend to the changing social context. And COVID-19 has had a huge impact on health in the United States as well as globally. And the impact of COVID-19, it has hurt all populations, but the effect has not been the same across populations. National data for the United States, decline in life expectancy at birth from 2019 to 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic. And you could see Hispanic and African American males, a decline of more than 3 years, Hispanic and black females, a decline by more than 2 years, and white males and females, a decline by more than 1 year. So if we go back to the data you just saw, you can see a decline overall for both blacks and whites in life expectancy from 2010 to 2020, and that's the impact of 2019, the impact of COVID-19. And you can see today a wider gap in 2020. 2010, there was a 4-year gap, a 6-year gap. So paying attention to what's happening over time is critically important to understanding these patterns. So what drives these large racial inequities in health? I was trained here as a sociologist, and I know that socioeconomic status, whether measured by income, education, occupational status, and wealth, is a central determinant of the distribution of virtually every desirable resource in society, and health is no different. So there are large inequities in health by socioeconomic status in the US and elsewhere. Here's an example of one data using PSID we published years ago, looking at the relative risk of all-cause mortality by income. And you could see incomes of thresholds from less than 25,000 to 115,000 or more. And you could see low income, the lowest income group has overall death rate 3 times that of the highest income group. But look, it's not a threshold effect, it's a graded relationship. Every higher level of income is associated with a lower pattern of overall health. And race ethnicity is in fact strongly related to socioeconomic status. Median household income by race, 2018, national data for the US. And you could see the data, but let me present the same data in a way you can't miss the point. The same data on the prior slide. I'm standardizing on the household income of whites as $1. For every dollar of household income white households receive, this is household level income. Asian households receive $1.23, a couple caveats. The Asian population, almost 2/3 of Asians in the United States are immigrants. They've come to the US with high levels of education or to pursue higher education. So that's one factor. A second factor is Asian households are more likely to be multi-generational than any other racial ethnic group, so to have more persons contributing to household income. But let's look at the historically disadvantaged populations. For every dollar of household income white households receive, African American or black households receive 59 cents, and Native American households 59 cents. Let's put that into historical context. We're talking about putting data into historical context. And you could see, first of all, that the 59 cents figure we saw for 2018, that was in fact identical to the gap 40 years earlier. In 1978, blacks earned 59 cents for every dollar whites earned. That was the peak year of the gains from the civil rights movement and the war on poverty of the 60s and 70s. And it got to 59 cents in 78. And in 2018, it's still 59 cents. And you can see throughout, Reaganomics was not good to the black population. It declined throughout the decade of the 1980s, and you can see in the early 1990s, it gets back up to 59 cents. Important take-home point, if we don't put things into context, we miss the significance of what is happening. And the absence of progress on the racial gap in income is much larger than most Americans think. There is a movement in the United States. I am being criticized by that movement. If you read the Friday's Washington Post, there's a lengthy article of how the pushback against scholars who do work on race and racism in the United States. And there's even a list you can look at, the professor watch list, the dangerous professors in the United States who will discriminate against students with conservative views and treat them badly, and I am on that list. Anyway, as bad as these data suggest, the racial gaps in income markedly understate the racial gap in economic status. Because income only captures the flow of resources into the household, it tells us nothing about the economic reserves that households have to cushion shortfalls from income. We get that from data on wealth that captures home equity and other financial resources and assets that individuals have. And this is the 2022 data. For every dollar of wealth that white households have, black households have 16 cents, Latinos 22 cents, other races, that's all the other groups combined in that category, 47 cents. What these data are telling us is when you are low in economic status, we may all have been in the same boat, the same storm of the pandemic, but in different boats. And some boats are better able to weather the storm than others. When my career started, most researchers thought that racial ethnic differences in health were simply a function of racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. And if you compared persons across different racial groups at the same level of socioeconomic status, race would no longer matter. We now know that life is much more complicated than that, and I'll show you one study we published years ago, and national data for the United States, life expectancy at age 25. There's a 5-year racial gap at age 25. But intriguingly, and I'm going to show you the data by education, the pattern by income is the same. The gaps by education are larger than the racial gaps. So whites who have a college degree or more education live 6.4 years longer than whites who have not finished high school. 6.4 is bigger than 5. And within African Americans, you see the same thing, a bigger gap within the race than the overall racial gap. And someone might say, well, why do we even collect the data by race? Let's just look by socioeconomic status. And I would say not so fast. Why? Because race matters at every level of socioeconomic status. And I'm showing you the education data. The same pattern is true for the income data. White high school dropouts live 3.1 years longer than black high school dropouts, and the gap widens as education increases. And remember, this is national data for the United States. The best off African Americans, those with a college degree or more education, have lower life expectancy than whites with a college degree, lower life expectancy than whites with some college education, lower life expectancy than whites who are high school graduates. So what do these data tell us? They tell us that there's something about socioeconomic status, income and education that matters for your health regardless of your race. But there's something else about race that matters even after you've taken income and education into account. Before I talk about what that is, I think there are some important recommendations for measurement here. Whenever racial ethnic data are reported, we must give more attention to interpretation. Always indicate why race ethnicity is being used and the limitations of the racial ethnic data that are being used, and some of these global categories, as Sylvia Pedraza made the point this morning in one of the sessions, is really important. There's variation within these broad categories. The presentation of data on racial differences should routinely stratify them by socioeconomic status within racial groups, because failure to do so may misspecify complex health risks and even lead to harmful racial stereotypes. But let's go back to the big question. Why does race still matter after we've taken socioeconomic status into account? And so I and other researchers have been asking and documenting the ways in which racism affects health. And racism and racial discrimination are alive and well in the United States, and racism has dramatic negative effects on physical and mental health. And it's a critical missing piece of the puzzle to understand the patterning of racial inequities in health. So let me talk briefly about the house that racism built. What do I mean when I use the term racism? I think of racism first and foremost as an organized system, a system that categorizes and ranks different groups, devalues and disempowers some, differentially allocates resources to groups based on this categorization. Central to it is an ideology of inferiority, some groups inferior, some superior. And that can lead to the development of negative attitudes and beliefs, prejudice and stereotypes, negative treatment, differential treatment, discrimination by individuals and societal institutions. How do we think of the complexity of racism? Back in 1967, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, political scientist Charles Hamilton wrote a book entitled Black Power. They coined the term institutional racism to capture dimensions of racism built into laws, practices, and culture of societies and institutions. James Jones, an African-American social psychologist, wrote a book about prejudice and racism, and he argued that these three aspects of racism: personally mediated, internalized, and institutionalized. Importantly, the historic use of the term institutionalized has been co-opted in the last decade by people new to the field and unaware of the history, who the institutional racism refers to only that which is occurring within institutions. That's not the way it has historically been used. I use the term structural or systemic or institutional racism interchangeably. One of the most powerful mechanisms of institutional racism is residential segregation. Here is a paper I wrote when I was here at ISR with one of my students, doctoral students, Chiquita Collins, where we argued that racial residential segregation was a fundamental cause of racial disparities in health, and we can't understand it or effectively address it without grappling with this reality. Now, I am not the first to talk about the centrality of segregation. My colleague Sherman James told me about a scholar at Duke University who had written this book on the history of residential segregation in the US and South Africa. And when I got this book and read it, I learned so much from it. I did not know that the framers of apartheid in South Africa got the idea of apartheid by looking at how well segregation was working in the United States. And Sell argues that segregation was one of the single most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the US, because it's beneath the radar screen. No politician is talking about it, but it is driving racial inequities in a large way. And someone says, what does segregation have to do with anything? Well, come on this journey with me. Think of segregation as a burglar at midnight. It slips into the community. And once it shows up, valuables disappear, like quality schools and safe playgrounds, and access to good job opportunities and a healthy environment, and high-quality housing, and good high-quality transportation and access to healthcare. Research in the United States reveals that all of these desirable resources vary by place, vary by where you live, vary by your neighborhood, vary by your zip code, vary by your census tract. And that is a result of segregation. And the measurement implications, it is absolutely critical to view racial inequities in health through the wide lens of the multiple effects that segregation produces within a society. So let me share with you some empirical evidence, first showcasing the work of William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, two of America's eminent sociologists, studied the 171 largest cities in the United States, and because of residential segregation, they concluded there's not even one city where whites live in equal conditions to those of blacks, and that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of black communities. If you're paying attention carefully, that's a 1995 study, and you say, well, David, have things gotten better over time? So I'm going to draw here on the work of Dolores Acevedo Garcia. She was in the same department with me at Harvard, now at Brandeis University. She has created a neighborhood opportunity index, ranking every county and most census tracts in the United States on over 30 indicators of access to opportunity, like the quality of schools and the graduation rate and the median household income and the home ownership rate and the quality of the air, water, soil, pollution, and resources for health like green space and healthy food environments. It's often called the Child Opportunity Index because she uses it heavily with children, but it applies much more generally. And what she found, studying the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the US, she asked the question, which American children by race live in the very low and low opportunity neighborhoods? 67% of all black children, 58% of all Latino kids, 53% of Native American kids, compared to 1 in 5 white and Asian kids, live in very low and low opportunity neighborhoods. On the other hand, if you say who lives in the high and very high opportunity neighborhoods, you get almost 2/3 of white and Asian kids and only 1 in 5 black and Latino kids. So place is a powerful driver of access to opportunity in the United States. And research reveals that segregation is in fact the central driver of the large racial ethnic differences in income and education that we observe in the first place. Don't take my word for it. I'm going to share with you research from two Harvard economists. David Cutler, using national data for the United States, using fancy econometric models I cannot even fully describe, but he's able to show statistically, if you could eliminate residential segregation in the US in a cohort of black and white young people making it early in their careers, if you could eliminate residential segregation, you would completely erase black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce racial differences in single motherhood by 2/3. All of these striking differences are linked to opportunity at the neighborhood level. And then Rash Chetty asked an intergenerational question, using not a sample, but all census data from 1989 to 2015. And he said, let's look at black and white children who begin life at the same level of household income. So he's controlling for household income. How are the children doing in the next generation? And he found that black boys have lower income than white boys in 99% of census tracts in the United States. Why? Because they're lazy? No. Because they're not working hard enough? No. They live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. Black boys do as well as white boys in neighborhoods with good resources, but very few of them live in such neighborhoods in the United States. And fully capturing, we're talking about measurement, fully capturing the downstream effects of segregation requires us also to consider chemical exposures. I'm drawing here on the work of Robert Bullard, where he shows that in high segregated areas, there are higher rates of being dumped on and poisoned. You breathe air that is 3 times more toxic. There's almost twice the density of oil and gas wells in high segregated neighborhoods in the United States. More natural gas leaks. Persons in those neighborhoods more likely to live close to dirty energy. Mothers and their babies have more bad pregnancy outcomes linked to heat and pollution, and have fewer resources to recover from heat waves, poor air quality, flooding, and other impacts of climate change. And this literally matters profoundly for health and even the educational success of kids. Here is a paper by Gary Evans and his colleagues that studied 6,000 elementary school children in K to 6th grade, and exposure to air pollution, one of the things you run into at higher levels in segregated neighborhoods, is linked to less progress in reading over time. And then they implemented a remedial program, and air pollution exposure diminishes the efficacy of the literacy intervention. So it leads to worse outcomes, and it reduces their capacity to benefit from an intervention to address the problem. What am I saying today? What the data is telling us is that racial inequities in socioeconomic status that matter profoundly for life and health do not reflect a broken system. No, it reflects a carefully crafted system functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in racism. The inequities we see by race and ethnicity in the United States are not random events or accidents or acts of God. Racism has produced a truly rigged system in the United States. And we need to drill down and document further all of the downstream effects of residential segregation. And I want to illustrate that by showcasing the work of another sociologist, Robert Sampson. He shows that segregation is the central driver of the elevated rates of violent crime and homicide in the United States. So this is a summary of his work. Residential segregation leads to lack of access to jobs, high male unemployment, and underemployment. He shows that these processes lead to high rates of out-of-wedlock births, female-headed households, and the concentration of poverty. And high rates of female-headed households leads to lower levels of supervision of adolescent males, which leads to increased adolescent risk behavior. And this is a schematic summary, but of empirical research that he has documented in his research study in the largest cities in the United States. Importantly, he shows that the association between male unemployment, poverty and family structure with adolescent risk behavior, violence, and homicide is identical in sign and magnitude for blacks and whites. The processes play out exactly the same way for both racial groups. Why do we see the problems more common in blacks? Blacks are more exposed to the conditions that give rise to these outcomes. And he concludes that racial differences in adolescent risk behavior are driven by racial inequities at a neighborhood level in the availability of jobs, in concentrated poverty, in opportunities for marriage and family structure. And this has important policy implications, and I want to contrast two options. Here, I'm showing you the approach of the Heritage Foundation, a publication that they provided, and they pointed out the importance of addressing family structure. And this, I'm quoting, "The poor aspire to healthy marriage, but they lack the norms, understanding, and skills to achieve it." So that's their problem. It is therefore reasonable for the government to take active steps to strengthen marriage. And therefore, what steps should the government take? Provide information that will help people to form and maintain healthy marriages and delay childbearing until they are married and economically stable. So one solution, policy solution, being proposed by an influential organization in the United States that is behind the Project 2025, tells us that the key is more information. But I want to share with you an alternative science-informed policy implication, shows what do we measure. And the question here was, would increasing economic opportunity for males actually increase marriage rates and reduce racial disparities in marriage? So I want to introduce you to Professor Jay Teachman, a sociologist out on the West Coast. And he looked at the military and thought there were things we could learn from the military. Black men in the military earn more on average than black men in the civilian labor force. And the command-control bureaucratic structure of the military has created a more race-blind environment. So there's some studies that show less discrimination within the military, not no discrimination, but less than in the civilian workforce. And in addition to income, military benefits include family housing, daycare centers, school-age activity centers. So Jay Teachman asked the question, what happens, what's the impact of black men enlisting in the military on marriage? I am not seeing the slide I am expecting to see. Something happened here. Well, I can tell you what the finding is. What the finding is, I think somehow a slide disappeared. He showed that military enlistment increases marriage over cohabitation, increases the stability of marriage, increases the quality of marriage. These effects are true for black men and white men that enlist in the military, but the effects are even stronger for blacks than whites. So that's Jay Teachman's work showing that providing the economic resources, in fact, makes a huge difference. So I've talked about the upstream mechanism of racism, structural racism. There's also discrimination at the individual level. And these experiences can be a source of toxic stress. Here is a hypothesis from Martin Luther King. He was not a scientist, but he said that discrimination is a hellhound that gnaws at Negroes in every waking moment of their lives, declaring that the lie of their inferiority is accepted as a truth in the society dominating them. Now, this certainly could be tested as a hypothesis. And one of the things I did when I was here at ISR was to work on developing measures to capture discrimination. I remember talking at a National Center for Health Statistics conference and suggesting the importance of developing measures to capture racial discrimination. And a gentleman with good intentions said what I was saying was important, but it was impossible to do, that racism was so complicated we could never measure it. But I came back to Ann Arbor motivated to develop measures to capture racism, immerse myself in the qualitative work that had been done by Joe Fagan on discrimination among African Americans, and Philomena Essed, a Dutch scholar who has studied discrimination among blacks in the Netherlands, black immigrants to the Netherlands, as well as African American women in California. And I shared with my colleague James Jackson that I was interested in doing this. And I have written about my work in developing these measures, and in that work, I said that James Jackson was the wind beneath my wings because he supported me, he encouraged me. I was going to use the Detroit area study to do it. He says I was getting credit for doing it. He joined me every day co-teaching the Detroit area study for no credit. He said we're going to raise more money to increase the sample size. We'll get 2,000 people. We didn't get 2,000 in Detroit, but instead of 450, we had 1,500. So James was just an amazing colleague also to work as I drafted the measures to give feedback. He was the wind beneath my wings. So this was the paper where we described the everyday discrimination scale and the other measures of discrimination that we developed. What is striking, it's not the only measure, I'll talk about the other measures in a minute, but it's the one that has been most widely used. One of my students 3 years ago identified 460 published peer-reviewed papers from around the world using the everyday discrimination scale. There's more now. It doesn't capture the big things, just the little indignities. Being treated with less courtesy and respect, receiving poorer service than others at restaurants or stores, people acting as if they think you are not smart or they're afraid of you or think you are dishonest, just little indignities. And this is the American Psychological Association using national data, used the everyday discrimination scale, showing the prevalence of everyday discrimination for various groups, with Native Americans reporting the highest levels. This is almost every day or at least once a week. Then comes African Americans and Latinos. Importantly, we measured the scale by asking individuals, have this happened to you? The question is not because of your race, has this happened to you? And then at the end we ask you, what do you think was the main reason? And what we are finding is attribution doesn't make a difference. So whether you were treated this way because of your race or your weight, or your sexual orientation, or your income level, or it doesn't matter the attribution, there are negative effects. And just to illustrate, I have been blown away by the associations that have been documented with everyday discrimination. Everyday discrimination is linked to new cases of metabolic syndrome, of cardiovascular disease, of breast cancer, of type 2 diabetes. It's linked to a number of health behaviors that are not good for health. It's linked to a number of biomarkers like coronary artery calcification, intima media thickness, a dose-response relationship with everyday discrimination and visceral fat for both African American and white women, heart rate variation, AFib, links to systolic and diastolic blood pressure, to poorer sleep, to inflammation, to cortisol, to shorter telomere length, to higher levels of allostatic load, to obesity and higher waist circumference, to less engagement with the healthcare system, and to a broad range of poorer mental health outcomes. So the range of outcomes across multiple societies that document the way in which we relate to each other on a day-to-day basis can be a source of health, or we can be pathogenic in our outcome, causing disease just by the way in which we treat others, and I have been struck by the findings. But blacks and US-born Latinos, this is from a study I did while I was here. This was a probability sample of the city of Chicago adults. Jim House and George Kaplan were the PIs of this project. I was involved with it. We used the discrimination measures. Looking at blacks and US-born Latinos had higher levels of work discrimination, higher levels of the major experiences of discrimination, like unfairly fired from a job, unfairly denied a promotion, not being hired, stopped physically threatened or abused by the police, and as well as high levels of everyday discrimination. And why does discrimination matters? These incidents are experiences of exclusion that can trigger what one scholar calls feelings of defilement of self. That's feelings of being over-scrutinized, overlooked, underappreciated, misunderstood, and disrespected. And the qualitative research on discriminations indicated that not only actual exposure matters, but you also need to measure the threat of discrimination. That because of the threat of discrimination, people are taking action, activity to protect themselves. And this was a paper I wrote before we had the measures, drawing on the fact that research indicates, research that has used ambulatory blood pressure measures, has documented that blacks have higher levels of blood pressure than whites, even while they are asleep. There is a certain level of vigilance being maintained. And I argue that the combination of living in physically dangerous urban areas and the maintenance of constant psychological vigil to deal with the many assaults of racial bias may lead some racial or ethnic groups to live in a state of heightened vigilance that can adversely affect their health. And so this is evidence blacks more likely than whites to have blood pressure decline or blunted decline during sleep. This pattern linked to increased risk for mortality and CVD. So it's really a consequential pattern. And so one of the measures I developed with James's support was what we call the heightened vigilance scale. We ask people, after we've talked about the experiences of discrimination, in dealing with those experiences you just told me about, how often do you think in advance about the kinds of problems you're likely to experience? How often do you try to prepare for possible insults before leaving home? How often do you feel you always have to be careful about your appearance to get good service or avoid being harassed? How often do you carefully watch what you say and how you say it, carefully observe what happens around you, try to avoid certain situations and places? And there are multiple studies that have documented that in addition to actual exposure to discrimination, when you measure the threat of discrimination through vigilance, it leads to elevated risk of depression. It's been linked to risk of sleep difficulties. It's been linked to higher levels of hypertension. So yes, it's not only the actual exposure, but because the threat is out there and people are physiologically becoming aroused to protect themselves, there are consequences for their health. So there are measurement implications beyond exposure to interpersonal discrimination. The racism embodied in segregation leads to higher exposure to a broad range of stresses. One of the things that distresses me sometimes is that I run into people who tell me, oh, they've found the everyday discrimination scale, they're going to use it in their study to measure the stress of racism. And they've now captured racism because they've added the everyday discrimination scale. Well, it captures one small aspect of racism. Because of segregation, going back to illustrating the Chicago study, blacks and US-born Latinos have higher levels of virtually every other stressful experience we measured in the study. Higher levels of major life events like the death of loved ones and unemployment and life-threatening illness. Higher levels of financial stress, higher levels of work stress, higher levels of stress in relationships, higher levels of neighborhood stress, in addition to higher levels of discrimination. So that these are not race-related measures explicitly, but the context of segregation, in fact, produce higher levels of exposure to these stressors. And this is from this Chicago study. There's a dose-response relationship between both mental health and physical health for every additional indicator of stress that individuals were high on. So every additional stress matters in terms of health. Another measurement implication is that there are hidden ways in which stresses linked to race and racism can adversely affect health. One study of African American women found that over 70% of these black women who had children were concerned that their children might be harmed by the police. What does that do to their anxiety levels if this is a constant concern they live with every day? And a study, the Fragile Family Studies of over 3,000 mothers in 20 cities, found that 23% of urban youth were stopped by the police by age 15, and mothers of youth who were stopped by the police were more than twice as likely to report depression and anxiety-related sleep difficulties. And here is a study I did with one of my former students, now a professor at Boston University. We linked a database from the CDC that had the mental health of the population in every state, and we linked it to a database that contained every police shooting in the United States. And what we found was that every police shooting of an unarmed black person led to worse mental health, not for the family and friends, but for the entire black population in the state in which occurred. Their mental health systems were elevated for 3 months. And it was a very specific effect. It was not every police shooting of a black person that did this. It was true of only police shootings of an unarmed black person. We believe the fact that the person was unarmed captured the sense for the population You didn't have to be doing anything wrong. It could happen to you, your mother, your brother, your sister, anyone. It's just a threat, unpredictable threat that could happen to you. So this is a spillover effect we don't think of, but we are documenting worse mental health for the entire population of that state for, in fact, 3 months. And these adverse effects of discrimination begin early in life. And that's an important measurement. We need to think of the impact of discrimination on the health of children and youth. Naomi Priest is a colleague from Australia who I've collaborated with her and work in the US and Australia. This is a review paper she did, finding 121 studies that have looked at discrimination among young people. And in this review, discrimination predicts worse mental health in 76% of the associations tested for young people. Discrimination inversely associated with resilience, self-worth, self-esteem in 62% of the associations examined. So yes, we are documenting negative effects of discrimination on children and youth. And I want to share with you what I talk about sometimes as the most disturbing study I have read recently. It's a study of suicide in elementary school children in the United States. And it is national data, and it found between 1993 and 2012, all suicide deaths in the US for children 5 to 11, the rate was stable overall in the US. However, the rate was stable, broken down by race, only for Asian children and Latino children. The rate had markedly declined for white children and had doubled for black children. The researchers went back and updated the data, and it's actually not just 5 to 11, it's 5 to 13, and that pattern exists up through 2015. Black boys and girls, 5 to 13, have rates of suicide twice that of white boys and girls. I try to think back to when I was in elementary school. I don't believe that I knew what suicide was. So to wrap my brain around the reality of black children committing suicide 5 to 13 at such a high rate is striking. The researchers, when they published this study, noted that this was the first published study documenting a higher rate of suicide for blacks than whites. Because for 100 years, if you look at the 15 leading causes of death, blacks have always had lower suicide rates than whites. And where within the black population we see this? We see this among children aged 5 to 13. And these data beg the question, what does it feel like to be a black child growing up in America today? And what are we going to do about it? We have some insight as to what's happening. The ABCD study of 11,000 children, mean age 11 years, they found that black youth reported higher suicidality than any other racial ethnic group, also reported more discrimination. And when they looked at the relationship between race, ethnicity, and suicidality, and they added reports of discrimination to the model, the effect of race went away completely. In other words, higher exposure to discrimination, average age 11, is the completely responsible, in this case, these are kids who are alive, of the higher rates of thinking about committing suicide. So I've talked about upstream institutional structural racism. I've talked about individual discrimination and the measurement implications of how we capture this comprehensively. I quickly want to touch bases on racism that's deeply embedded in our culture, that has implications in terms of health in the quality and intensity of care that individuals receive. While I was a faculty here at U of M, I served on the National Academy of Medicine's committee that produced the Unequal Treatment Report. And we found that it was released in 2002, the book was published in 2003, called Unequal Treatment, across virtually every therapeutic intervention, from the most simple to the most complicated. Minorities receive fewer procedures and poorer quality care than whites. That's compliments of the Washington Post. This was the press conference when the report was being released. Sitting next to me was Risa Lavisa Murray, who was a co-chair of the committee, and Alan Nelson, a former president of the American Medical Association, who also co-chaired. There was a lot of interest and attention to this report. It was very striking findings. Last year was 2023, 20 years after the unequal treatment report was published. And I attended multiple conferences, spoke at a few. Where are we 20 years later? And honestly, the word is bad, but I'll just share with you two studies to give you a sense of the picture. A study of 1.8 million hospital births in Florida between 1992 and 2015 found that when cared for by white doctors, black babies are 3 times more likely than white newborns to die in the hospital. The disparity is cut in half when black babies are cared for by a black doctor. Another study, national data for the US, 318,000 patients with Medicare, all of them with advanced cancer, all of them in their last weeks of life. And the question is, do they get opioid medication for their pain? Black and Hispanic patients are less likely to get opioid medication for their pain, and if they get medication, they get a smaller dose. And black patients are more likely to, they're dying of cancer, they're more likely to undergo urine drug screening to see if they're abusing opioids. And black men experience the greatest inequality for both opioid access and urine drug testing. So the problem persists. There are lots of studies, but I just showed you two to give you a sense. We know that one of the factors driving this, I don't think American doctors wake up every morning saying, what am I going to do to get my minority patients today? It's implicit bias, unthinking, unconscious discrimination is a driver. There is a solution to it. Here's a study from the UK. Randomized, double-blind, parallel group placebo-controlled design. A single dose of a beta blocker eliminated implicit bias for the next 2 hours. So we can eliminate it. The issue is, it is not practical for us to medicate the entire healthcare workforce for the rest of their life. But this is an important study. We live at a time where implicit bias is called fake news. One of the reasons I'm on the professor watch list is I talk about implicit bias. So that's a problem. And so the fact that we can intervene on it with a pharmacologic agent suggests this is, in fact, a fundamental process that is taking place in the brain that we can intervene on it pharmacologically. There are a number of strategies in social psychological research that have been shown to be effective in implicit bias, and I'd like to talk about the Devine solution. Professor Patricia Devine from the University of Wisconsin at Madison has put all of these strategies together in one study and one intervention, and has shown that she can get non-black adults to increase their awareness of bias, increase their concerns, to implement the strategies, and they are effective in producing substantial reductions in bias that remained evident for 3 months. 3 months may not sound like a long time, but there are reviews of the literature on implicit bias that shows that the traditional approaches raise awareness levels but do not change behavior. What is different about what Professor Patricia Devine does? It's not a 2-hour workshop. It's not an afternoon program. It's a 12-week curriculum with homework exercises that people have to practice. You do not change deeply ingrained, unconscious practices by a 2-hour workshop. It makes you aware of this phenomenon, but it does not change behavior. What else can we do? This is a paper I wrote with Lisa Cooper summarizing a number of things that we can do. Strategy number 1, we need to build more health into the delivery of medical care. Improve access to care for all. I'm not going to elaborate on that. Improve the quality of care, though that's a no-brainer. Diversify the workforce to meet the needs of all patients. I'll comment on that. And provide care that addresses the social context. I'll also comment on that. Diversifying the workforce to meet the needs of all patients. Here is a randomized controlled trial, highest quality of scientific evidence. Took 1,300 black men in Northern California, give them a coupon to go to a Saturday morning clinic. When they got to the clinic, they were randomized to see a black doctor or a doctor of a different race. Those who saw a black doctor were more likely to talk about other health problems, more likely to do the screening for diabetes, more likely to get the flu vaccine, more likely to do the screening for cholesterol. So greater engagement with the healthcare system when there was racial concordance. Here is another study that shows if there are more primary care black doctors in a county, health is better in that county, or counties across the United States. And this is the problem we face. In 1965, 2.9% of physicians in the US were black. Today, 5% of physicians in the US are black. In 1965, about 9% of entering medical school students were female. By 2010, it was 40%. Today, it's about 50%. Affirmative action, this is an important point, was for minorities and women. The political right in this country talks about affirmative action as something that only helps minorities. Affirmative action has worked much better for women than it has for minorities. Most of those women were white. So affirmative action has brought the greatest benefit to white households in the United States. Yet it is attacked because of its presumed negative effects. And you've seen the percentage of black and Latino healthcare providers across multiple outcomes. This is the data I just shared with you. I have some good news. Another study from Northern California documented racial ethnic inequities among patients with HIV/AIDS in the receipt of the treatment, in the treatment actually working, and when patients taking the treatment as they were supposed to. There were these disparities. But the researchers went back and reanalyzed their data. They had administered a cultural competence scale. And they found that when cultural competence was high, regardless of the race of the provider, there were no racial disparities in health. What did it mean to be high on cultural competence? Providers who said family and friends were as important to health as doctors, who said that social history contributed to how they cared for their patients, who said they were familiar with the lay beliefs their patients had, who said they asked their patients about alternative therapies they use, who said they find out what their patients think is the cause of their illness, who said they involved their patients in decisions about their health care. What emerges from these questions is, or the answers to these questions, is providers who engage, who respect, who communicate with their patients. Under those conditions, there were, in fact, no disparities. What else do we need to do? We need to provide care that addresses the social context. The World Health Organization asks, what do we accomplish if all we do is treat illness and send people back to live in the same conditions that made them sick in the first place? I want to share with you an innovation in healthcare delivery of taking the social context seriously. It's a high-quality study, randomized study, and it's a 1978 publication, a study that Len Syme did. Why aren't we doing it? We have good evidence. He took 244 low-income hypertensive patients, 85% of them black, randomized them to 3 conditions: routine care, go to your doctor, get your medication, go home; health education, go to your doctor, get your medication, go to a class taught by a professional for 12 weeks, learning about hypertension; and third, go to your doctor, get your medication, but then we take people from the local community, give them 1 month of training, lay people, no formal medical background, and send them to visit persons with hypertension. They talk about their blood pressure because they learned a little bit about it, but they also are taught to assess challenges these individuals face and to refer them to resources that exist in the community to help people with problems that they face. And what did the study find? After 7 months, patients in the outreach group knew twice as much about blood pressure as those in the other 2 groups. They were more compliant in taking their blood pressure medication than those in the other 2 groups, and among good compliers, blood pressure was twice as effective in controlling their blood pressure, and therefore they were much more likely to have their blood pressure controlled. A 1978 randomized controlled trial. Why aren't we putting this into action? Another innovation in healthcare delivery, adding lawyers to the clinical team. When I moved to Boston, I spent a morning at the Boston Medical Center, the safety net facility in the greater Boston area, and the head of pediatrics developed a program that allows a primary care provider in the pediatrics unit to refer a patient to a number of specialists. The new specialist added is a lawyer. Yes, there's an on-site attorney to solve problems in the lives of the patients. Because a mother comes with a child with asthma, and the asthma is secondary to the poor housing conditions where they live. and the mothers complain to the landlord who has done nothing, all the asthma medication in the world will not help that child to breathe symptom-free if they go back to live in the same conditions that made them sick in the first place. And it does make a difference when a lawyer calls and says, you're in violation of the Housing Code of Massachusetts, we're going to sue you if you don't fix the problem. It is a dramatic example. There are 250 hospitals across the country that are implementing this model. We also need, strategy 2, identify supportive, protective resources and resilience resources. Here is a study done by Gene Brody in rural Georgia. Black kids, aged 16, 17, and 18, they measured discrimination. Those who were consistently high on discrimination at 16, 17, 18, by age 20, I didn't say age 40, I said age 20, they had higher levels of stress hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, high levels of blood pressure, high levels of inflammation, high levels of BMI. But among those black kids who were embedded in good social relationships with their parents, their teachers, and their peers, there was no relationship between exposure to discrimination and biological dysregulation. The exposure and the social ties protected them from the negative effects. There's a national study of black Americans, a study out of PRBA, found that 3 aspects of religious engagement, religious attendance, church-based social support, seeking religious guidance in everyday life, reduced the negative effects of the stress of discrimination on the mental health of African Americans. Here is another randomized controlled trial and intervention that took black teens, where the suicidal ideation problem is a problem, and what they did an intervention with both the parents and the children. For the parents, teaching the parents effective parenting, and then adolescent self-regulation and black pride for the children. This eliminated the relationship between exposure to discrimination compared to the control group and suicidal ideation. So I'm saying there are strategies that have been shown to work. A striking example from Canada, the First Nations, or the indigenous population of Canada, at the time of this study, had one of the highest rates of adolescent suicide in the world. 2 researchers went into 196 First Nation communities and found that although the group has one of the highest rates of adolescent suicide in the world, half of the communities had no suicides at all. And they were struck. What makes the difference? They identified markers of challenging the government of Canada for titles to land, right of self-governance, control over services, and having a building in the community where they taught their children their culture and their history. Each of these indicators of advocacy, protest, empowerment, and cultural affirmation was associated with a lower risk of suicide and a strong dose-response relationship between the number of markers and the prevalence of suicide. Helping youth be meaningfully engaged in making a difference for their community and valuing who they are is a mental health promoting activity. But we need to move further upstream. We need to create communities of opportunity that involves enriching the quality of neighborhood environments, increasing economic development in poor areas, improving housing quality. I'm just going to give you 2 examples in the interest of time, but these are examples I review in the paper with Lisa Cooper of investing in early childhood. I visited this as part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission to Build a Healthy America. We went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where there's the Carolina Abecedarian Project. What do? At birth, they randomize children to enter an early childhood development program. Average age of entry is 3 months. What do they get? A safe and nurturing environment, good nutrition, good pediatric care. It's birth through 5 is the program. Just birth through 5, then they're on their own. By age 21, those who got the program, better mental health, lower drug use, more active lifestyle, better academic performance, better job success. By their mid-30s, markedly lower risk factors of cardiovascular disease. This is somewhat similar to the Perischool project done in this area of an early childhood investment. This is the systolic blood pressure difference between the treatment group and the control group in their 30s, linked to what happened birth through 5. Then we need to improve economic well-being. It's a paper out of here with Jim House and others showing that the impact of the Social Security program on the health of the elderly, providing additional economic resources, reduced mortality. Improving neighborhood and housing conditions, place matters. Moving to Opportunity program took people in public housing, randomized them to move to better housing, no health intervention. Improvements in the mental health of parents and kids, lower levels of obesity, severe obesity, and diabetes risk. Just changing the neighborhood environment leads to improved health. I want to share with you a striking example of neighborhood transformation. It's the purpose-built communities. It took the East Lake Meadows community in Atlanta, which had 90% of the families there were victims of a felony in this housing project every year. Public housing dilapidated, only 13% of adults employed. One of the worst performing schools, the local elementary school in the state of Georgia. They've torn down the building, worked with the city, built the villages of East Lake, 90% reduction in violent crime, high quality mixed income housing, all able-bodied persons employed. The school, 60% of the students qualify for reduced price lunch, but it's one of the best performing in the state of Georgia every year. Purpose-built communities shows it can be done. And you know what they're doing? They're providing free technical assistance to any community in the United States who wants to replicate their model. It can be done. I want to give you one last example of a dramatic transformation, the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. Rush leaders noted a 14 to 60-year gap in life expectancy within their service area. And they decided they would change their mission. They are now not just focused on healthcare delivery, but their mission is to improve the health of the community. They recruited the 5 other health systems in Chicago to join them. They created listening sessions to hear from the community. They committed to share decision-making with the community. They decided to direct all of their financial resources of their business enterprise to promote community wealth building and economic vitality. They want to reduce the life expectancy gap by 50% by 2030. They will hire, purchase, invest, volunteer locally, that is opening recruitment centers for employment in the disadvantaged communities they serve, and providing pathways of opportunity, giving an employment preference to those persons, using local labor for capital development, developing apprenticeship programs. They are a big employer in the community, local purchasing program, dramatic transformation. So we know what can be done. There are examples of amazing interventions. What's holding us back? What are the barriers we need to address? I go to Martin Luther King. He said, the majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia, embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. I'm just reading what he said. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. How accurate. He wrote this in 1967. We face 3 challenges. We need to raise awareness. Most people don't know what I shared with you today of the challenges faced by disadvantaged racial ethnic populations. More importantly, we need to develop the political will, and we need to build empathy so that we can address these problems. We need to recognize that these inclusive policies would benefit all. White families, there are more poor whites than poor African Americans. White families would benefit from these initiatives. We also need to understand the larger context. The US is 4% of the world's population, consumes 48% of its medical resources, but ranks 67th in the world on life expectancy. Whites in the United States, I've looked at black-white differences in health. Whites do not have good health. They have the worst health among whites in wealthy countries in the world. So there is opportunity to improve the health of all. And finally, as we look to the future, as we implement policies as an institution, I heard talk this morning, and I was thrilled to hear Michigan committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, because we need to identify, nurture, and mentor the next generation of scientists ensuring that scientists from underrepresented backgrounds are included. I am an affirmative action baby. With all my hard work, support of family and friends, and divine blessings, would not have successfully launched my career without a minority fellowship from the University of Michigan. And I was privileged not only to be accepted to Michigan, but to get an amazing mentor, Jim House. He cared. He went out of his way to support minorities and women. We had a celebration. Over 40 of his students came back to Ann Arbor to celebrate him. And you know what was striking? Over 80% of his students were minorities and women. It did not happen by chance. This is my dissertation committee here at the University of Michigan. 3 sociologists. Ron Kessler was in the T32 that he ran here at ISR. Walter Allen from sociology, and Barbara Israel and Victor Hawthorne from the School of Public Health. And then I received critical support from African American scientists. Without I would not have been successful. All of these men had connections to Michigan. Norman Miles did a PhD in history, teaches at a school in southwestern Michigan. I lived in Battle Creek, Michigan, was planning to do a PhD in sociology. I'd looked at a program at Michigan, looked at a program at Michigan State, looked at a program at Western Michigan in Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo was closer to Battle Creek. I was leaning towards applying to Western Michigan University simply because I wouldn't have to move. And Norman Miles made a visit to the hospital where I worked in Battle Creek. And he asked me what I was doing with my life. And I told him, I'm thinking of going to do a sociology degree. Wonderful, he said. Where are you planning to go? I said, I don't know, but I have these 3 schools in Michigan. But I'm thinking of going to Western Michigan. He says, absolutely not. You need to go to University of Michigan. You cannot be. Now, this is important. I am not a first-generation college student. I'm a first-generation high school student. And I did not understand how academia worked. So this was foreign to me, but I took his advice. Alden Morris, a sociologist here in the Department of Sociology. I'm in my final year of the sociology program. I'm walking in the LSA building in the sociology department, and Alden says to me, David, I was just talking about you. You're going to be hearing from Yale soon. I said, what am I going to be hearing from them about? He says, well, they were asking me who was good coming out of Michigan this year, and I gave them your name. And I said to him, I don't want to go to a place like Yale. That'll be too much pressure. I just want to go to a nice small school. I can get my work done. And he said, David, let us go to lunch. And 2 days later, I was sitting at a restaurant at lunch with Alden Morris, and he explained to me how academia worked. Yes, there'll be high expectations of you anywhere you go. You came from Michigan. But the better the place you go, the more resources you will have to achieve success. And based on his advice, I applied to Yale, got the job, started my career at Yale. When I got promoted at Yale, I came back to Michigan and came back to the social environment and health program, but for the first time in my career, got heavily engaged in working with the Program for Research on Black Americans. And I thank James Jackson enormously for the positive impact he had on my life and for the way he went out of his way to support and enhance my success. I'll leave you with 2 quotations. Martin Luther King said, it may well be that we'll have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people. And Robert Kennedy, speaking in South Africa in the 1960s, said, each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And those ripples can build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. There's a lot of work we need to do to achieve equality in the United States and equity, and I trust that each one of you will be motivated to be a tiny ripple of hope, so together we can make a difference. Thank you so very much for your time. We have time for questions. I think there are some microphones somewhere, I guess. I'm not seeing them. Yes, there's a microphone. If anyone has any questions or comments. Yes. You don't want to use the microphone so that the whole audience hears you? I don't think they'll hear you. You're right up front. Okay, someone is bringing the microphone to you.
Do you know any research being done comparing African American people going to church, why they go into church, compared with white people, why they go into church? Are there difference between the reason?
I have done work on religious involvement and health. I am not aware of a study, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, that looked at the reason for church attendance. So what has consistently been found, though, is religious attendance for both blacks and whites is associated with better health. In one national data set, there was as much as a 7-year difference in life expectancy for whites between those who attended services regularly versus those who never attended, and a 13-year difference for African Americans. So there are big differences. I have not seen data on the reason for attendance, if the reason for attendance makes a difference. So, not sure. But doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm not aware of it. Any other questions or comments? I usually get a lot of questions. Okay. Yes, 2 brave souls, one here and then one. Yes, the mic is coming.
Hi, I was wondering if the differences in if you see differences in generation, you showed that despite the same educational background, people might not have at first those difference. There's still a difference in health, but I was wondering, looking at that several generations later, do those inequities still exist?
So I think the question is if there are inequities in health, we still see racial differences at every level of education with multiple generational status, persons who've been, I have not seen research that directly has addressed that. You would need to have multiple generations of higher education. I have not seen research that address that. But one of the reasons for the difference is what is called in the literature the non-equivalence of socioeconomic status across race. And so the wealth differences are huge, and the access to resources at the opportunity level are huge. And I think once those structures remain in place, those patterns remain in place, you will see the outcomes that we see, because you cannot think of the education level just as at the individual level. You have to think of what that education buys for that individual and what resources, that health-promoting resources, it provides access to. And remember, don't miss the point that within the black population, someone with high education is doing better than someone without less education. They are doing better, but there still is a gap, and it's dramatic differences. The differences in wealth by race are quite striking. There was a recent study that showed among members of Congress the remarkable wealth differences linked to the number of slaves their forefathers, ancestors held. And the wealthiest congresspersons are those whose foreparents had at least 50 slaves, and those who had 30 did better, and those who had 10 slaves. So there was variation linked. So it's showing wealth differences today linked to 200 years ago, is what I'm saying. And the wealth differences are a big piece of the puzzle. I think there are 2 questions in the middle, there are lots of questions now. Yes.
I have the microphone. Dr. Williams, I've heard you speak before about the empathy gap and
Yes.
about the potential of empathy and the potential of spending more time with people who are different than us to alleviate some of what you've brought up today. I wonder if you see any of that happening, or if you just wanted to elaborate on that a bit.
Sure. So, yes, I do talk about the empathy gap. There's only so much I can put into one lecture, so you select. Importantly, yes, I mentioned that one of the underlying factors is the empathy gap. And I'm not unique with saying that. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the book Philadelphia Negro. He has a chapter on Negro health, 1899, and he shows the racial differences. And as he comes to the end of the chapter, he says, the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race. And Du Bois continued, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. And what he called peculiar indifference, the fact that here are people who are suffering and we do not care. As a society, we're not implementing policies to address it. He says this is the most difficult social problem. Scholars have looked at the empathy gap. It's not unique to America. It's been found on every continent that we tend to have more empathy for what happens to someone from our own group than someone from another group. There was a somewhat disturbing study look of white children in the United States, having them see someone being stuck in their arm with a needle. At age 5, no empathy gap. They're seeing a black person and a white person, they alternate them, and they see the black and white person experiencing the same amount of pain. By age 7, the white children are tending to see the white person experiencing more pain than the black person. The action is identical. By age 10, it's pronounced. So the empathy gap appears to begin very early in life. What exactly drives it, we don't know. There are interventions that have worked on reducing the empathy gap. It has to do with putting yourself in the shoes of the other person, understanding their suffering in the light of if you were in that situation, what would you do? So there are strategies to address the empathy gap. And importantly, if we look at a situation and feel empathy for it and feel it's unacceptable, that builds the political will to address it. Then we say this is unacceptable. We have to do something about it. So the empathy gap has been linked to being able to mobilize support for change. So it is an important issue. I haven't seen any successful interventions on a large scale, but there are examples in the literature of small interventions that are successful. But it's really putting ourselves in the shoes of the other person or group and feeling the pain that they're experiencing. Next question.
Hi, I wanted to thank you for this. It was super compelling. I had a question on the front of, I guess, scale of intervention. I'm curious, many of the interventions you highlighted that were most successful in addressing some of these racial gaps are at the community level, and you nodded to Project 2025 and the somewhat fraught situation at the national level. I'm curious if you think there is a path forward for national level interventions, or if you think that more focused community level, like grassroots stuff may be the most efficient path forward for now, at least until we figure out whatever the heck is going on at the national level.
Yeah, I am concerned about what's going on at the national level, and some days a little more optimistic than others, but not sure. Let me say, I think we literally need to think strategically and work at every level. I think clearly we would need to try to address the empathy gap in the communications that we do. One of the things I didn't talk about, but I'm very interested in is communication. How do we talk about these inequities in a way that resonate? But anyone who wants to drill more deeply into it, the Frameworks Institute is an organization that does work on communications. And they have actually issued, years ago, and are currently doing more work for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but issued an issue brief on how to talk about race. And they actually show that the ways in which the language many advocates for racial equity use, they're not effective in building empathy. They're not effective in building support. And they pointed out alternative strategies and ways in which you frame the conversation that is more effective. Now, that report was 15 years old, so we're in a different environment. I know they're currently doing work for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but I do think we need to think more strategically. I think historically, many of us from academia think once we get the facts right, once we have the right data and evidence on our side, we are ready to conquer the world and everybody's going to see it our way. No, they're not particularly impressed with whether it's a randomized controlled trial, it was a cross-sectional study. It makes no, but really, the average person doesn't make any difference to them. So I do think we need to give much more attention to communication and how do we talk, how do we share the information in a way that connects emotionally, for empathy, it connects emotionally, and people can identify with it, and so that we can build the political will to address it. So I think it's a really important question that needs to be, issue that needs to be addressed. Next question. I'm not controlling the mic. Oh, someone. Okay.
I have it. Thank you so much. This was a masterclass of a talk, seriously. I'm really interested in your thoughts about measurement. In particular, could you detail your thoughts on ways to move forward and pitfalls about measuring structural racism? And also for individual racism, what are we missing in how we're measuring?
I think I would not say we have perfectly solved the problem of individual level racism, but I think we are doing a reasonable job, and it's working across multiple cultural contexts in capturing it. I think we need to keep in mind that racism is something that evolves over time. And so that the measures that we have now are not necessarily the perfect measures for all time, so be sensitive to what is taking place. At a structural level, I do think we need to identify, I talked at length about segregation. I see that as a fundamental core component. I do not believe it is the only structural upstream mechanism. I think we need to identify them, think through what the pathways are, and document the ways in which they affect health. But I do think those are good places to begin. I highlighted the work of Dolores Acevedo Garcia with the Child Opportunity Index, as it's called in some circles. She has a version 3 just came out that is even more comprehensive. It is a good place because it is that comprehensive in terms of capturing the components. So I think those would be good places to begin. But certainly we need to, one of my points was paying attention to the changing nature of these phenomenon and then wanting to capture new developments that would give us insight as to some of the underlying processes. Next question, yes.
Thank you for this brilliant talk. I'm thinking, though, of Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Deaths of Despair, and wondering if that seems to you as an opportunity for perhaps creating a broadening of empathy toward others and situations, or if it seems more as a diversion from where the central problem really is that you've been focused on.
Case and Deaton was the suggestion. Deaths of Despair, Case and Deaton. Right, yes. I think it's a great question. Short answer, I don't know. And let me tell you why I say I don't know. It goes back to communication, and we would need to test, is Deaths of Despair language that works? And sometimes we think, I'll give you an example of my colleague, Jack Shonkoff. He chaired the National Academy of Medicine panel on early childhood adversity, and he was doing outreach. At the time, he was the dean of the policy school at Brandeis. He was doing outreach with governors, talking about the stress that children are facing and how it shapes their life and so on, and it wasn't working. Because you telling them, the governors about, did he stress? Did children have stress? I have stress. Everybody has stress. It just didn't resonate. And he worked with Frameworks Institute. He's a strong advocate of Frameworks Institute. And they came up with a language, you've probably heard it, but didn't know this origin. Frameworks Institute developed for him the language of toxic stress. And just started to talk governors about the children are experiencing toxic stress. It changed. They experience stress. They don't experience toxic stress. Just the language says this is something severe, out of this world, much more different than I experience. And it opened the doors for him to get them to think about policies to implement it. And that's why I'm thinking what we need to do is think of, I don't know that there's a magic bullet, but we need to put communications and communication strategies under the same lens that we put other strategies, test various strategies, and seek to identify what works. And I think Frameworks Institute's work so far is a good place to begin, but these things evolve over time. And remember, people have been fed certain messages that are deeply embedded in their mind, and how do we upend their assumptions that they bring to the subject? And how do we open their door to be receptive to an alternative way of thinking is important. But I'm saying there is a science there, and we need to be more actively engaged in developing, getting others to do this work and to capitalize on it, to be effective in getting the policies we would like to see implemented. I think there was one last question. Oh, we're out of time. We're out of time. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and attention.